Hi, everybody. Welcome to Heathen Talk, episode 18. Tonight we have Ben Waggoner
18?
with us talking about, isn't it 15, not 18.
15.
Wow. It's episode 15, kids, not 18. We're talking
Staying
about
school.
language tonight. You'll also notice that we are down a host. Torn is on his way to the Savage Lands, where he and his wife are going to do some bonding. And, yeah, so, Lauren, why don't you go ahead and introduce our guest?
Well, our guest is Ben Wagner. He is the current publications director for The Troth. He is an author, a translator, a really smart guy, and my favorite kindred brother. So thank you for joining us, Ben.
Glad to be here.
So who are we toasting this week?
Well, Ben, I don't know if you knew this, but we have a tradition where we toast someone who's doing stuff in heathenry once a week.
We've toasted you, actually.
And this week,
Well, thanks.
we have.
Yes. So this week is awesome.
We're toasting Torin. He's not here, so it's the perfect opportunity to do it.
Yes.
Torin is being instrumental in putting together Cascadia Moot. He's formed a tribe in the Seattle area, mods one of the biggest online True gathering holes, are True on Reddit, and is a co-host of the greatest heathen podcast on the internet. So, Torin, this one's for you.
Yeah.
Nazdarovye.
He's also attempting to make a gluten-free beer that doesn't suck. So,
We call that cider.
yeah, I already have cider.
So tonight, I'm drinking Washington beer since Torin can't be here. It hails from Fort George. It's the Cascadian Cavatica Stout.
Tonight,
Anyone else drinking anything fun tonight?
I'm drinking ginger ale because Payway had gluten in it. So there you go.
All right.
So we're going to talk about language this week, and I think this is a really interesting topic because a lot of what we know is colored by the language and word meanings from, kind of the pre-Christian era. But I think it's also can be difficult, especially, I am most of the time depending on a translator because I don't speak. English is barely functional, so we're not going to try anything else. So, what do you think, Ben, as far as translating, what's kind of the biggest challenge in trying to convey these, not words even, but these concepts into kind of the modern vernacular?
Good question. I mean, on the one hand, you've got some, there are customs, for example, that people followed in, the Viking and post-Viking eras that people don't follow today, and we don't have any easy equivalents for them. There's a tale that I'm working on right now about a guy named Halldor Snorrason. And he lived he was a retainer of King Harald Hardrada, or Hardraudi, if you go Norse. And there's a whole chapter in it about how he was penalized by the king for failing to keep up in a drinking bout. Because apparently when everybody was sitting down and drinking, you basically had to keep up. And if you didn't, you could be forced to drain a penalty horn. And it's all very interesting, but there's no obvious, English equivalent for words like penalty horn, or the technical term for drinking foul, drinking sleitulega, meaning you're holding back and you're not draining the horn as fast as you're supposed to. So some of those things are really hard to convey because there's no nice, neat, single-word equivalent. And there's always the question of who your audience is. I mean, do you translate Gothi as priest, or do you leave it alone? Are your readers likely to know what a gothi is without being told? Or do you translate it as priest, knowing that that's not perfect because the Gothar, in Iceland anyway, were secular leaders at least as much as they ever were religious leaders? Translating is just all about making fine decisions like that, and knowing that there's no single right answer to how do you translate this text. And you just fumble along and do the best you can. What was the question?
That was actually a really good answer, Ben. So,
Thanks.
so you're talking about there was really no analogies to things. So that distance that we kind of have from that culture, I know, those choices, even when you're, I imagine, making those translation, it really can even color how heathenry ends up getting practiced. I know that we see some of that from the Victorian era translations of some of the Eddas and whatnot, where it's really not terribly, it's very poetic, not terribly accurate.
Right. Well, not all of the Victorians, but a lot of them reasoned this way, that at the time they were written down, the sagas and Eddas, or at least the stories and poems behind them, were already very old. And the idea was that Icelanders would have perceived these things to be very old. And the way that you get that across in English is by using a lot of very archaic words. So if you read the old translations by people like William Morris, to us they're almost unreadable. I mean, they make Hollander look like Hemingway. And they coin a lot of rather strange words that you almost have to be a linguist to understand what the heck they're talking about. Today we tend to favor a style that's just a lot more direct, a lot more plain-spoken. Herman Paulson and Edwards, his collaborator, produced a lot of translations that are still in print that come across to me as almost chatty. And again, I don't know there's a single right answer for what style you're supposed to hit, but certainly your choice of style colors whether you see the practices described in the Eddas and sagas as being, ancient and remote, or accessible and open, I suppose. So, yeah, your choice of style can certainly color how you perceive what the ancients were doing. And, there's even errors in translation, like when Lee Hollander reversed the genders of the sun and the moon, to make the sun male and the moon female, which is not what's in the Norse, but I guess he thought it was an error in the text or something like that. That certainly can have theological repercussions.
Now,
is that okay, or should I keep babbling?
Oh no, you're doing great. I mean,
all right.
You're welcome to talk as much or as little as you like.
Yes.
All right.
Now, I think one thing that we kind of wanted to all talk about is, and Josh, feel free to chime in at any point with questions or whatnot, is, what did the language that they used, the language that's not only the language that was used would be written down, but also even examples we have from the earliest, kind of written down sources we have, say about that culture? Like, are there, because I know you said that there were some words that just didn't have any real analogy. So what, what does that say about how their culture, I guess, differs from kind of the overculture we have now as far as English?
Well, it's tough because it's not really just one culture that's different from ours. The sagas, writing, aside from the runes, writing texts in the Latin alphabet on paper or parchment is a Christian practice. It was Christians that brought it to Iceland, and it took about 100 years for people to start writing the Icelandic language, and it took them a little bit longer for them to start writing anything about their own history and their own myths and their own past. So all of the text we have, you have, the heathen era practices, but they're described 200, 300, 400 years after the fact. And in the sagas that I've translated the most of, the so-called Fornaldarsögur, or sagas of ancient times, a lot of what's in there about ancient practices is more, it's not accurate reporting of what heathens actually did. It's what 14th century Icelandic Christians who did have good memories and an oral tradition, what they thought their ancestors were doing. So we're seeing the heathen culture through the prism of the medieval writers who copied these down, and through the prism of our own language and the translation that we have to do. So there's actually kind of two removes from the heathen past, not one.
How would you say that a Reconstructionist-minded heathen could compensate for that? Because if we're viewing it essentially through two different lenses, we're obviously getting a distorted picture of what the ancient heathens did and why they did it. What can we do to correct for that distortion?
My pat answer is use them, if you're trying to reconstruct, use these as triangulation points. So, for example, there's a story in the old manuscript, Flateyjarbók, about Ugmund Ugmund the Hard Hit, and his encounter with Gunnar Helming, Gunnar half and half, more or less. And that's the one where Gunnar is framed for a murder, and he escapes, and he hooks up with this priestess of Frey, and she's taking the idol of Frey around in a wagon, and she's heading for Sweden. And Gunnar ends up displacing the idol, and the Swedes are very happy because Frey has now come alive, and he's walking among them, and he's knocked up their priestess, and the weather is great, and the fields are all fertile, and they think it's wonderful. Now, by itself, you can't take that too literally, because Flateyjarbók was copied down in 1380, don't care. I think it's 1385, don't quote me on that. And it was copied down in the form that we've got it by a couple of monks who were kind of going out of their way to make the old ways look silly and wicked. But you can compare that idea of the priestess carrying the god's image around in a wagon to bring fertility to the land with archaeology. You've got, ritually buried wagons like the one at Debjerg. You've got Tacitus's account of Nerthus. You've got some other accounts from continental Europe about images being carried around to bless the fields. And each one of those is just one point, but I think if you look at all of them and kind of try to triangulate, try to figure out what these sources have in common, you're probably on much more solid ground.
Now, I actually have a question for kind of both of you, and something that just kind of has come to mind, because we've talked a lot about the differences between, and we tend to refer to as pre, 90s, 80s, and pre as kind of first generation heathenry. When you start getting to the mid 2000s and before, there's kind of a gray area, but basically the pre-Hammerite, post-Hammerite era, where,
okay.
or I would even argue the pre-We Are Our Deeds, post-We Are Our Deeds divide. But regardless, how do you think that these linguistic issues and the fact that we have a lot of the information, especially that was available prior to kind of the internet, I mean, this is just completely going to be guess, but just thoughts, influenced, those are kind of first generation modern heathens?
Hmm. Maybe I'll let somebody else take that. I don't know if I've been around enough first generation heathens lately.
Well, I will say just from reading, it's a situation where that's what they had. They didn't have as many.
Hmm.
I would think because kind of building off what you said, they just didn't have as many triangulation points.
Hmm.
So they had to go with what they
Yeah.
had, and what they had wasn't always good because not everybody could drive to an hour or order a $500 book, or their
Hmm.
library couldn't get in this rare saga that might have some answers that now somebody's got it on the internet.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, the internet has certainly caused an explosion in the amount of information that's out there. I mean, Google Books has a lot of old, not always perfectly sound, but still very valuable texts that are available for free. And a lot of people have started putting original translations of online. I mean, people like Gavin Chappell and folks like that. You do have to be a little bit careful with some of them, but certainly there's a lot more data points that are available to anybody with a computer and a router than there used to be. As
So,
far as what people make of it all, I don't know. I mean, I am, an absolutely unapologetic, total and utter lore geek,
Yes, you
but
are.
not everybody is. Yes, yes, hell yeah. I fly that flag proudly. But not everybody is, and not everybody has to be. And for every heathen who likes to get drunk and argue about how to present mediopassive Icelandic verbs, there's probably 100 who are perfectly happy just to raise a horn and hail the gods in their own way and contribute to the community in other ways. And I think I kind of got off on a tangent from what you were asking.
That's okay. That's the story of this show.
It's allowed? Okay, good.
Oh, well, if it wasn't, we wouldn't be able to fill up our normal airtime. So.
Oh, okay.
trust me, if our other host was here, there would have been many more tangents by now.
Oh yeah,
Okay.
because but I do think that is kind of interesting. I do want to touch on something that you said there because it's really important to me. Is that not everyone has to be a lore geek. There's this big
Hmm.
pushback on the idea that heathenry is the religion with homework.
Hmm.
And while I'm somebody who can understand that because I frequently find that a lot of texts are inaccessible to me, fact of the matter is that homework doesn't always have to be reading. That
Hmm.
homework can be the hands-on experience that you learn from lore geeks. It can be,
Hmm.
there's so many different ways to learn. I just kind of wanted to put that out there because I think that is just important to say because people kind of jump on this, well, what about people who can't see or have reading disabilities? I'm like, well, there are other ways to learn than just reading. And we have audiobooks, and I'll just say Ben has an Audible audiobook out there just to plug for him.
All
That's
right.
really
Yeah, it's the
actually good
saga.
quality.
Yeah, it's the sagas of Ragnar Lothbrok, and it was professionally done. And yeah, I'm quite happy with the way that turned out. But if you if you look at the ways the sagas were passed down, at least in later history, we don't know quite as much about the heathen period, but in later Iceland, they were certainly copied from manuscripts, but the manuscripts were for reading aloud. And it was one of the things that you do, especially on those winter nights when it gets dark at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and there's a blizzard outside. Everybody gets into the main room of the house. The person with the best voice lights a lamp and reads the sagas. And most Icelanders just grew up learning the stories. I mean, I'm told they still do, but I mean, they read them in books now. But before modern times, I mean, before like 1900, most Icelanders experienced the sagas and the poems and things like that by ear. And they were all extremely familiar with the sagas and the heroes. I've read accounts from elderly people in Iceland about when they were little, they would go out and get broken sticks and pretend they were swords, and one person would be Sigurd the Volsung, and another would be Gunnar of Hlíðarendi from Njál's saga, and somebody else would be Egil Skallagrimsson, and, you know, they'd all fight. They would play at being these saga characters, you know, the way kids today play at being, I don't know, Transformers or whatever the heck it is that they do. So they had the stories really internalized. It's the kind of thing that they would just grow up hearing and being deeply familiar with. And I think heathenry today is always going to need a few lore geeks like me who can, you know, get drunk and argue about Icelandic medial passive verbs and that sort of thing. But I think as time goes on and we start building community, you know, assuming heathenry does not destroy itself in one colossal flame war, which sometimes I've thought would happen, as we build community, I think we'll get, with later generations, we'll get kids that will grow up knowing the stories already and maybe not needing to do homework quite so much, because it's just something that they'll hear and just something they'll absorb, you know, as they grow up, when their minds are spongy and able to soak up knowledge like that. I think that's the way it, you know, that's the way it was done. Probably the way it was done in heathen times too.
Oh yeah, and I think that can be a challenge for some of us that are not from heathen families, and, you know, being in kind of a non-heathen overculture where we don't have that same frame of reference to a degree, and that, I think, can be a challenge.
But it's something I think we can pass on. I mean, I'm certainly trying to teach the myths to my own kid, and he does sometimes get Thor the god confused with Thor the superhero, and most recently he's gotten Thor a little bit mixed up with John Henry, but, you know, that's okay. You know, that's okay. The point is that whether he decides to be a heathen or not when he comes of age, you know, he'll grow up knowing the stories and familiar with them, and, you know, able to pass them on himself if he chooses. And people who don't have kids, you know, can still do things like, oh, I don't know. One of the things I wish I was better at is, I think we need more heathen kids books. I mean, we've got a lot of books of, you know, deep lore and things like that that would mostly be of interest to adults, but I'd love to see, you know, kids' picture books and things like that coming out of the heathen community that we're writing for our own. That's something that I don't know, one of these days I'll start to work on that once I've got every saga translated. That'll be my next challenge.
You know, the thing is, Ben, you say that, but I fully believe you could eventually translate all of the sagas that are available if given enough time.
Well, I've got all but 2 of the legendary sagas, the Fornaldarsögur, are translated. Not all published, but a lot of them need polishing. But there's a humongous number of sagas that were actually written. The Icelanders were writing new sagas up until roughly 1900. And a lot of them have never been published at all. Those that have been published have rarely been translated. And there's probably at least 200 of those things. Very few people look at them. A lot of them are probably kind of junk as far as strict heathen reconstruction goes, but still, you know, you never know what you might find in some of those. You know, it's always possible that one of those has preserved, you know, a little bit of oral lore or something like that, and somebody ought to go looking. So yeah, I think I've only got probably about 300, 400 sagas to go.
You got it. No problem.
Mm-hmm.
Don't tell Mandy I said that.
So,
I won't.
are there any bits of knowledge or insights that have been surprising when you're doing a translation? Like you're going through the source material and you see a word and you realize that it means something a little different than what it has been commonly thought to mean.
Can I think about that for a little bit? There's nothing
Sure.
immediate that comes to mind. I mean, there's a lot of cases where the meaning of a particular phrase isn't fully understood, or where it's been debated, and you kind of have to decide which meaning you're going to go with. There's actually one of those that comes to mind. There's that famous stanza about a man with no friends in the Havamal, and it's the one about there's the pine tree that's not protected by bark, withers and dies, and that's what the man with few friends is like. You know the piece? You know the stanza?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yes.
Well, the original says, I think it's the pine tree in the thorp, Thorp, and there's some people that have assumed that that means like the windy hill or the wilderness or something like that, but it's not a common word in Old Norse, but it actually seems to mean village. So it's not the pine tree out in the wilderness, it's the pine tree in the village, and the image there seems to be that it's a tree growing in the middle of the village that, pigs are eating the bark and cows are scratching their butts on it, and, nobody really cares for it. But it's not because it's alone, it's because it's in the middle of a village, and yet it's not appreciated by the beings that live there. But people have gone back and forth about this, and when you're translating, you put all of that sort of thing in footnotes, because, boy howdy, I do love me some good footnotes. But, in the end, you have to decide which interpretation you find is more convincing. And every translator has to make choices like that, where the meaning could go plausibly one of 2 or 3 or 70 ways. And, the translator can really only convey one and has to make that choice. That's why for the really important texts, like the Poetic Edda, you probably should never read just one translation. It's always a good idea to read several. And again, try to triangulate off of those to try to get to what the original meaning might be. So yeah, learning the original language does not necessarily make things simpler.
Now, I do want to ask you, if we're talking about translations, I kind of want to bring up very briefly and hit on this, because you are an author of one of the many novelty translations that are out there, the Bubba Mall.
Right. Ah, yes, the Bubba Mall.
But I'm curious, have you had a chance to read like the Cowboy Havamal by Jackson Crawford, or some of the Boston? I can't remember what the Boston one is called. Our producer will tell us here in a second.
Well, there was the Havamal for New Yorkers years ago. I haven't seen that around for a while. And I haven't seen the Boston Havamal. And I haven't had a chance to sit down and read the Cowboy Havamal thoroughly. I mean, I do like the idea of taking what's mostly very practical wisdom and trying to couch it in very colorful yet plain-spoken American dialect. I mean, I think you can actually get something out of that maybe you couldn't from one of those Victorian translations. So what I've seen I've liked, but I haven't really sat down and read the Cowboy Havamal yet.
Do you think that there's anything...
The Havamal, go ahead.
Do you think that there's anything that gets lost when you translate into the common vernacular? For instance, I mean, I make no secret of this. I grew up Christian, going to church, went to a Christian college,
It happens to the best.
and one of my favorite translations was actually a British vernacular translation, and it included
Mm-hmm.
phrases like, uh, Judas was gutted, and it meant, he'd lost his
Mm-hmm.
courage.
Mm-hmm.
Um, do you think that there's anything that gets lost when you do that?
Well, again, you have to kind of just make the judgment call as to what. See, you can. There's a lot. Okay, there's a lot of different approaches to translation, and one of them is, what are you trying to do? And if you're trying to translate it so that your English readers get some idea of what the Icelandic audience would have felt back then. I mean, there's always some guesswork in that, but many of the sagas, for instance, are actually written in pretty plain uh, Norse, with the syntax is fairly simple, and the original, readers and hearers of the sagas would not necessarily have perceived them as being particularly strange. So probably there, a fairly plain English translation probably gets the original feeling of them across a little better than one of these Victorian, King James translations that you can read. Um,
Mm-hmm.
on the flip side, I'm still working on my own translation of Volsunga Saga, and I'm taking my time with that one because that's the one that you've got to get right. And the first 2/3 of it are pretty plain Icelandic, and then about right when Sigurd comes to the court, the Burgund court of Gunnar and Hugni, the style completely changes. The subject matter changes. The saga starts talking about Sigurd's coat of arms and things like that the Vikings didn't even have, and the style gets a lot more flowery and starts using a lot more words that were borrowed from medieval German or medieval French, and it starts getting downright, chivalric on you. And the style very much switches up into something that's a lot more, lo, yea, and verily, forsooth, I do declare. So, yeah, I think if you're going to translate effectively, you have to have some feeling for the Icelandic style. And there are ways you can convey that in English. But, yeah, I don't think you should translate everything in a plain style or in a fancy style. You've got to try to convey the stylistic diversity as best you can.
Now, I could
That
kind of
makes sense.
switching topics just a little bit. I'm curious that when it comes to things like theology, is there a language of theology, like Latin is for Christians when it comes to heathenry?
Mm,
Or just that, because I don't think so, but I don't know nearly as much about this as other people, so.
mhm. I don't know. I mean, with the only texts that we've got that were actually written by people that were pre-Christian heathens are some of the earlier rune inscriptions, and those can be plenty ambiguous. You know, if you're, the almost virtually all of the Old Norse and Old English texts that we have, were written by Christians and have a certain amount of influence from that direction in their word choice. If memory serves, you have the word hamingia, which means, sort of your luck or your fortune. At least in later Old Norse texts, it comes to mean almost the same thing as the Christian concept of grace. So you have to be aware of that. And I mean, Old Norse is not, it's a wonderful language. I love it. I want to keep learning and studying it until, for as long as I'm around on Midgard. But it's not pure, never been touched by Christianity language. I mean, there's really no such thing.
Well,
You
so
still
one of the
have to
things I've
reckon with the
noticed,
fact that some of what they write about is colored in that way.
one of the things I've noticed in talking with heathens much more educated in the subject matter than myself is that there's often a mixture of terms that come from a lot of different languages, and oftentimes they're anglicized. Like, we have worth and frith, and then you have somebody will throw out Utanyard and Innanyard and all this stuff. Do you think that use of the language comes from a desire to have something similar to a theological language, the way we combine these terms to try and communicate religious ideas?
Any group, religious or not, needs some kind of common vocabulary, or they can't discuss anything. And I mean, we need to borrow words like, frith, for example. I mean, some people would translate frith as peace, but that's not exactly it, because frith is not necessarily still and calm and quiet. You can have quite loud arm-waving arguments and still be frithful. It's a more dynamic state than I think the English word peace connotes. And I mean, for that reason, we probably, we borrow words from a variety of sources. And I mean, someone once said that English follows other languages into alleys, knocks them over the head, and goes through their pockets for vocabulary. So I've got no problem with borrowing theological words from any source that we find useful, to describe our common religious experience.
And we've actually done a whole show on frith.
Okay.
And tried to go into some of the intricacies of it, because it is a word that gets tossed around a lot that doesn't necessarily mean what a lot of people think it means. So that's a whole nother. That was a whole 90 minutes on frith. I still don't think we covered everything that we could have covered about it too. So, and that is, I think
90 minutes and 1,000 words from me, and we didn't even scratch the surface, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think that. Go ahead.
When you come across it, or when I come across it translating, there's the question of, okay, do I leave this untranslated so the heathens will hopefully get what the original is about, but non-heathens are going to be scratching their heads as to, what the heck is this? What is the chief rabbit god from Watership Down doing the middle of this saga? Do you translate it? Yeah, do you leave it untranslated? Do you translate it as peace? Do you translate it as peace and insert a great big footnote that says, well, this is not exactly peace, and, insert about 15 citations and pump your bibliography up? And there again, there's no single answer that's going to satisfy everybody. You just have to try to know your intended audience and do the best you can. And hopefully the audience, if they read a translation and it says peace, will read another translation and check to see what the other translator has done. And if they don't know the original language, at least they can get maybe a better idea of what the original's about by doing that.
Well, how often do you run across situations like that where you're, for instance, inner yard is translatable as inner yard, right? It's this whole concept that we've adopted as that which is familiar, that which is family safe. It's the inner yard. How often do you run across that situation?
That's where you keep the cattle in spring before you drive them up to the mountains in summer.
Right. So when you're talking about these things, or when you see a term like that come up, how useful is it to try and explain it in modern English and struggle and trip over yourself and go through all of that?
Right. Well, I mean, Sometimes you can find an English equivalent that will do the trick. I can't think of a concrete example off the bat, but I might, instead of translating something like, and they were living in Frith, I might say, instead of trying to translate it word for word, I might say, their life was mostly harmonious, or something like that. Sometimes you can find a workaround that'll get the idea across. Sometimes you just put it in, again, you put it in a footnote and hope that people will notice the little number by the word and go read it. And again, if you're, the translations I publish in Iduna, which I'm fairly sure almost everybody reading that is heathen, you don't have to explain so much. But if it's a publication like, the Sagas of Ragnar Lothbrok, which is being used as a college textbook, you can't take as much for granted, and you end up having to put a lot more footnotes into your work.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, again, I don't know if there's a single solution to the question. It's a matter of knowing what your audience is and knowing who you're translating this for and how you're hoping it'll be used.
Now, when you're translating for a primarily heathen audience, you're translating for, I would argue to say, religious audience. How does that color how you phrase things? Like when you're translating for Iduna.
Okay. I don't know. I think I find myself, again, I think a little more likely to maybe leave in words that an outside audience wouldn't necessarily get. Like, okay, since we're on the subject, like Frith, for example. In the most recent thing I've been working on, there's some scenes that take place at Yol, and I think for Iduna I've left that in as Yule, and I'm not sure if I want to keep going with that, because it is taking place at what is theoretically a Christian court, and it's not obviously so, but still, the author probably meant Christmas. So I might keep it as Yule for a heathen audience and switch it over to Christmas for a more mixed audience. I don't know. I'm still kind of mulling that particular one over.
And I can understand where that would be something you would want to think about because, well, I mean, what you put out to an audience that is religious, whether you like it or not, is going to influence someone's belief and practice. It may not be very big, but there's going to be some influence. So there's a lot of weight there almost, I would think. Or have you not thought of that before and I totally just put it on you now?
Okay. Actually, if you could repeat that a little bit, you're kind of breaking up. I'm not sure why.
Yeah. I would think that there would be almost a little bit of weight of responsibility on you, thinking that, hey, you have to translate this for someone that eventually what you're translating could affect someone's belief or practice in some way, big or small.
Yeah, translating the bit about the blood eagle in the Sagas of Ragnar, I certainly am concerned that somebody might actually try that someday. Yeah, a little bit of background.
That's an odd place to come back to the conversation.
No, there's some scholarly controversy over the reference to the blood eagle. Originally comes from a poem that's got kind of scrambled syntax and unusual vocabulary, and you could read it as King Ella's back was carved with a picture of an eagle, or King Ella's back was carved to look like an eagle, or King Ella's back was carved because he's dead and an eagle was eating him. And Roberta Frank argued that it probably just means that King Ella was dead and eagles were scavenging him, along with wolves and ravens. The eagles are, the beasts of battle that are always described in skaldic poetry as eating corpses. So it's possible it's all due to a misunderstanding of an old poem. But the idea of blood-eagling somebody by, cutting their rib cage open and pulling the lungs out to look like some horrible version of eagle wings, that's certainly a lot more memorable, and that interpretation took hold, even among some of the saga writers themselves. So, yeah, in that case, I kind of hope nobody ever attempts to try blood-eagling, because it really does not sound like the kind of practice we should revisit. But if you follow the one interpretation of it, it makes our forebears sound a heck of a lot more bloodthirsty. If you follow the other interpretation, it's it's still pretty bad, but it's a lot more. I hesitate to say civilized, but that's the only word I can come up with.
Yeah.
To kind of shift things a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that there's a need for heathens to learn source languages like Old Norse, Old English, Proto-Pi? My brain's not
Proto-Indo-European. Got it.
Yeah,
Okay.
That's the one.
Okay, all right. I think we'll always need somebody to do it. I hope we always have, at least a few people who can hack that sort of thing. But I don't think it's a skill that everybody needs to pick up. I wouldn't want to see anybody scared away from heathenry by, thinking that you've got to get, a PhD in Germanic linguistics before anybody will take you seriously. You do get some of that in. I'm thinking of Edward Thorson's plan in A Book of Troth, which basically meant that the elders of the Troth were all supposed to have the equivalent of a PhD in Germanic studies, which conveniently enough he had and almost nobody else did. But no, I don't think everybody needs to do it, but I think we'll always need a few lore geeks who can hack it. And then, too, there's more than one reason why somebody might want to learn one of the old languages. The Theodish were very big in learning them so that they could compose, original poems and prose of praise and worship to the gods in the old way. Richard Culver was kind of famous for writing rather complex high church liturgies in Old Frisian, which certainly sounded impressive. I went to one of his I guess bloat is not the word, but I went to one of his feignings once, and it kind of left me with the feeling of, well, I guess I worshipped somebody. I'm not entirely sure who. Lauren, I think you were there. This was Texas Harrowmoot
Yes,
years ago.
Yeah, that was an interesting experience.
Yeah, well, that was the one where we started rewriting "I Want to Be Sedated" by the Ramones. Remember?
Yes.
The stumbles last 24 hours a day. I want to be Theodish. No offense.
I happen to know that we've got a few Theodish people in the audience tonight.
Yes,
that will appreciate that.
Not anymore, you don't.
In fact, our content manager is Theodish, but I'm waiting for this. So I have a question.
Okay, but anyway, there's nothing. There's certainly nothing wrong with doing that if you feel like the gods enjoy being spoken to in the languages of old. Cool, great, terrific, more power to you. That's absolutely awesome. My motive for learning the language was basically there's still a lot of sagas and a lot of stories that either haven't been translated or they were translated once 50 years ago and the old translation is kind of looking a little tattered. And I want to bring the stories back. I don't, well, okay, I do want everybody in the world to buy my books, but aside from that, I want people to retell and learn and internalize the stories and the values they represent and argue about them and debate them and discuss them and tell them to their children and maybe get us back something a little bit closer to what the medieval Icelanders were doing. Get everybody to, as someone said, learn the lore so they can get over it. And, that's another good reason for translating. And then people who have a personal connection to a culture, like if they are of Icelandic descent, might want to learn Icelandic because, it's not just the language of the ancient heathens, it's the language that, the grandparents used to talk in when they didn't want the kids to know what was going on, that sort of thing. Lauren, I assume for you it might be learning Swedish because I know some of your family is.
Yes.
And sometimes you can feel a strong connection with your much more recent ancestors by learning a language. But again, the reasons are going to vary for different people. And, hopefully the gods are smart enough to understand us when we talk modern English. So, yeah, I don't think it's something everybody's got to do, but there's a lot of good reasons why people might choose to do it.
So, as a follow-up to that, for those that are interested in it, for instance, I've been haphazardly trying to learn Old English. Do you know of any good sources other than going to university and studying these that the autodidact among the heathen groups could utilize to learn these old languages?
There's a couple of, there's a good Old Norse book that has just come out, and I'm completely and utterly drawing a blank. It's in my Amazon Save for Later shopping cart, but then so are about 80 other books. So eventually I will get around to picking that one up. And it looks good. I haven't looked at it yet. I don't necessarily recommend people do what I did, which was basically start with the Old Norse text and an English translation and an online dictionary and just try to work my way through it word for word. That's kind of the linguistic pedagogical school known as masochism. But it was relatively easy for me because I'd formerly studied Spanish and also Russian. And yes, Russian is Slavic and Icelandic is Germanic and all that. But I think every language you pick up actually helps you. You get used to not taking your native language's grammar for granted. Russian actually has more features in common with Germanic than perhaps you might suspect. Grammatical cases, for example, which is something that's kind of hard for people to get their heads around if they're starting from modern English, because we've almost completely ditched those. So I did have I think I had a couple of advantages coming in. But yeah, what I did is not necessarily going to work for everybody.
Yeah, I've been trying to use...
Yeah, I'm probably not doing that.
Wallington's book, and it's a bit of a chore.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, a lot of the older Old English textbooks kind of presuppose that you've already had, some college level background in, modern English grammar and linguistics. And so they'll jump right away with, list of nouns of the first declension when all you really wanted to know is how do you say, where's the bathroom? So, yeah, with a lot of the traditional textbooks, they're presupposing that you're starting out as a college junior with an English major. And, those can be a lot more difficult for the casual reader. The magazine of the Englischen Geschichte, this England-based group that's not necessarily heathen, but that's devoted to Old English culture. I think they discontinued it, but their magazine used to have a page of useful phrases. So in one issue that I read, there was a whole page of what to say if you suffered an injury. And they were things like, I need to see a healer, and I have a pain in my head. And there were things that the healer might say to you, like, this leech will only suck a little of your blood. And it's kind of funny. It's not the sort of thing, it's not very practical, but things like that, I think, might be a better hook, a better way to engage people's learning practices than, jumping in with nouns of the first declension and all of that stuff that the traditional textbooks use.
I can agree with that.
Yes. This leech will only suck a little of your blood. I mean, how many times have you needed to say that in Old English and you couldn't remember? It happened to me 3 times just yesterday.
I remember just from high school language classes, my favorite part of learning French was learning how to insult people and telling them to shut their mouth.
Right. Yeah,
so
I don't know if I'll ever.
How that would be.
Yeah. I don't know if I'll ever publish it, but I've started collecting examples of Viking, Old Norse profanity and sex references. They had a pretty good supply of interesting synonyms for penis, I'll tell you that. And yeah, one of these days I might publish.
If you want, we'll put that up on our Facebook.
Yeah, we're happy to publish that kind of stuff.
Okay. Yeah, one of these days I might publish a book called, all of the Norse sagas, just the good parts.
I like it.
And yeah, they could include, the tale of the Vulsi, and in my latest book, there's a saga about 2 heroes named Bosi and Heraud, and Bosi keeps getting into bed with young ladies, and his pickup lines are things like, I want to water my colt at your spring. Or I want to put a stopper in your wineskin, or things like that. And what keeps this from being a pornographic saga is the fact that it's so silly.
Kind of reminds me of like Song of Songs. It was one of my favorite classes I took when I went to Simpson University.
Yes, the rounded bowl. Yes, the rounded bowl that never runs out of spiced wine.
Yeah, it's
Your breasts are like twin fawns of a gazelle.
There was, I forget which one it was, but something like a guard tower. It was pretty entertaining.
Yeah, your hair is like a flock of goats moving down the slopes of Gilead.
Yeah.
It goes bah, and it's very smelly.
Your legs are like cedar trees. I remember that. Your legs are like cedar trees.
This week on Heathen Talk, we talk about the Bible.
Well, okay, so there was this Christian comedian that my mom liked, and he had a song basically where he was trying to use the lines from Song of Solomon's pickup lines. I don't remember Song of Solomon, but I remember that song. So that's my reference there.
Right, and we've got our own saga that's got a couple of pickup lines like that. Do you think your colt can manage it? He's not used to a spring like mine. Well, I'll push him in if there's no other way to get him to drink. Boy, your colt certainly has a stiff neck. Yes, he gives me a lot of trouble when he's not allowed to drink. I'm not making this up.
No,
this is the actual dialogue, and it's funny, but a little bit cringe-inducing too.
As I have read your latest book, I have read it, and he's not making this up. And we've had conversations about this for a long time when you started translating it. So it is 8 o'clock out in Cascadia. That would make it 10 o'clock in the Savage Lands, otherwise known as Arkansas. So if you have questions for us and you're listening to the live feed, ask them on our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/Heathen Talk. If you're on IRC, get the questions to Mark, our producer, so we can start answering them. And I have the first question, and it's mine, even though I kind of know the answer. Yeah.
Lauren?
Yeah.
You call Arkansas the Savage Lands, but I've always personally thought of Arkansas as being Vanaheim. because the Vanir are associated with ferocious wild pigs,
Yes.
and at least according to Snorri, the Vanir are also associated with incest. And if there's two things that Arkansas is known for, it's, wild, savage, woo pig, suey razorbacks, and, well,
Well,
I
Yeah.
think the shoe fits.
Cousin, uncle, stepdad.
in Lauren's defense, it's actually Lauren and I who call pretty much anything outside of our little section of North America the Savage Lands. We're from the best place on the planet, Cascadia. Everywhere else is the Savage,
I see. Right.
including
So
Anaheim, apparently. So.
Okay, so it's basically like referring to everything that isn't L.A. or New York as flyover country.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So you are the first person to coin, as is named after you, Wagner's law or Wagner's theory of heathen interaction.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that we reference quite a bit, both here and it gets referenced on Facebook and Reddit.
Mm-hmm.
So
Now, before you get too far into this,
yeah,
I'm going to drop some names here. There's been one podcast that has given us a hard time for this, and several bloggers, Facebook users, and others who have decided that we're just a bunch of big meanie heads for saying this.
Okay.
So go ahead, Lauren.
So tell us about how you came up with this theory.
I honestly don't remember specifics. I think it was just a matter of, if you're on a bunch of heathen mailing lists circa 2005, this is the kind of behavior that just comes shining through, is that, half the people are picking nits with other people's heathen practice, and the other half are claiming that, hey, you've got no right to do so. And it just seems like so many of the online flame wars and arguments that I saw could be boiled down to, you're not the boss of me, hey, you're not doing that right. Wash, rinse, repeat, ad nauseum. Well, yeah, I don't think there was a specific catalyst, but, the basic pattern of behavior was completely obvious to anybody that was reading Our Mead Hall in 2005.
Oh my, that
seemed to be all they did. Yeah, that was most of what was going on there.
Yeah, I remember.
All right, no offense to anybody who loved the old Our Mead Hall, and I kind of miss it too, but, I'm not wrong.
You're not the boss of me.
Hey, come on, you're not doing that right.
So, for those of you that didn't catch that, our sign-off, you're not the boss of me.
Mm-hmm. Right.
You're not doing it right.
We use it, and this, I'm gonna go ahead and name the podcast because I'm the boss and I can do that. Specifically to Tier 1 Viking podcast, we're joking. It's funny.
It's
Don't take
tongue-in-cheek.
it seriously.
Yeah, it's
right.
all tongue-in-cheek.
I'm honored to find that something that I just came up with as a throwaway is actually, got some legs, and is actually turning into a little meme of its own.
There's even a graphic somewhere I've seen on Facebook. Someone actually made like two Vikings arguing over a horned helmet, whether helmets had horns or not, into Wagner's law. So yeah, you're kind of big on the internet, Ben.
Oh, wow. Cattle die, kinsmen die, but I know one thing that will not die, and that's that silly meme you came up with one day. Yeah, that might outlast everything
never
else.
die.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So Ben has graciously agreed to give away one of his books on the show tonight, and it'll be the same way we do most of our giveaways. And which one is this? Is the Six Sagas of Adventure, which is
this
awesome.
is the latest one. This is the one that has the saga of Bosi and Heraud. This is the one that has the pornographic saga.
Always a bonus.
Right. These are not necessarily the oldest sagas, and not necessarily the most authentic as far as ancient practices go, but they're a lot of fun. Some of the sagas that I translate are things that have very deep roots, like Volsunga saga and things like that. But the Icelanders composed a lot of sagas. They're a little bit like westerns in that they're set in this past that, on the one hand, really did exist, and yet, on the other hand, is very much a literary creation. Where the good guy always wears a white hat, the bad guy always wears a black hat. There's always a hooker with a heart of gold, and the drunken sheriff that sobers up in time to save the day, and all of that. So these sagas of adventure aren't necessarily the ones to use when reconstructing your personal practice, but they are a heck of a lot of fun. Even the non-pornographic parts. There's plenty of draugs and undead and evil sorcerers that can teleport through the earth, and unpromising heroes that suddenly rise to the occasion in the hour of need, and beautiful princesses and fabulous treasures. And I mean, yeah, they're a lot of fun. And as much as we talk about reconstructing minutiae, some things are just enjoyable to read. And I had a lot of fun putting these together.
And then,
So
if
there they are.
for people who don't win the giveaway or want some of your other books, where can people buy your books?
Oh, the print versions are all on Amazon. They're also available on lulu.com. They're all available through Lulu as PDF files if you don't want a print version. With Amazon, Six Sagas of Adventure is currently available as a file for the Kindle, if that's the way you like to read your books. And some of the older ones will eventually get put into Kindle, in my copious spare time. Still working on that.
And I will say that so far, all of the ones I have from Ben that are from Lulu, from the PDF files, render just fine if you're using screen readers or if you're using VoiceStream to listen to PDFs. They all have worked pretty well on there. Just to let people know, because we do have a lot of people that like to listen to stuff while they drive. So we have a question.
How are they going to win this particular book, Lauren?
They're going to go on the Facebook page. They're going to. There will be a post going up at 8:30 Pacific, which is 10:30 here in Arkansas. You will have until 11:59 on Tuesday Pacific time to like it and comment each, and your like is worth one entry, your comment's worth one entry, and we will randomly select one of those and announce it on next week's show.
All right
then.
So again, 8:30.
Yeah.
Pay attention to the Facebook page.
Exactly, and invite your friends to like us. They might win too, and then it'll be awesome. So we have a question from one of our listeners from Skullgrim. Ben, how do you feel about the dominant Icelandic Scandinavian culture that influences modern heathen practice, even among people who have little or no Scandinavian ancestry? Is cultural specific heathenry, i.e. Anglo-Saxon, Continental, Frankish, the right way to go?
You're asking me what the right way to go is?
Of
Well,
course.
I know that you're not doing that right. Come on, somebody say it.
You're not the boss of me.
Okay, there we go.
I'm the boss of you, technically, but anyway.
Right. On the one hand, given how much the Vikings got around, people probably have more Scandinavian ancestry than they might think. I mean, people with ancestry from Ireland, for example, or England. Both of those places were settled at one point, or at least in part, by pretty sizable numbers of Vikings. So don't count out the fact that you don't have Scandinavian ancestry. But as far as whether cultural specific heathenry is right or not, that is just ultimately up to the individual. That's not something I would feel comfortable giving a pat answer to. If you're of, let's say, German descent, and you really, really want to, make contact with what your German forebears thought and believed and something like that, then by all means, learn Old High German, learn modern German so you can read all the folklore, or get with, I'm not going to pronounce it right, Urglova, the Pennsylvania German group that my good friend Rob Schreiber is leading right now. If not, don't. But that's not an answer. That's not something I can answer. I can only tell you for myself that I don't have any recent Scandinavian ancestry. I do have plenty of British in me. And I think I started this whole mess wanting to learn some Old English, and then I started picking up a little bit of Old Norse, and I was like, yeah! Being able to read the sagas when I finally started being able to do it is like, cool! And, I don't personally identify as Scandinavian, but these things just, got a hold on me, and personally, I'm perfectly happy to use the Scandinavian god names and things like that. But again, that's such a subjective question. I don't have an authoritative answer.
Josh?
Well, so I've got another subjective question for you.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that using the ancient languages during ritual adds to the significance of the event, or is it superfluous?
My
That's
take
also from
is
Skullgrim.
Okay, my take is it depends on the ritual and it depends on the audience. If the use of an ancient language can add mystery and flavor and awesomeness, on the other hand, it can be completely off-putting. If you've got people attending the ritual who have only just found out about Asatru, and you deliver a 30-minute epic poem in reconstructed pronunciation Old Norse, odds are that's probably going to bore them or scare them off. On the other hand, if you're in with a group of people that's already cool with that sort of thing, then I'm sure it can add a great deal. But I would say it probably just depends on your audience, on who's at the ritual, what you're trying to do, the personal feelings of the people involved, how much endurance people have. Not everybody is likely to be able to sit through a recitation of the entire Havamal in Old Norse sung to the ancient lyre. So, again, as far as what the gods want, I figure they're perfectly capable of telling you. On a mundane level, as far as what your kindred wants and what your guests will be most inspired by, that very much depends on the situation that you're in.
Now I want to bring up our favorite topic in relation to this, which is regional heathenry, because that's very much in, and I know that we've talked about there's been this movement towards establishing more regional traditions. That's actually something we've really not had a chance to talk a terrible amount about between the two of us, but I'm curious how you relate that in terms of, your own kind of opinion as someone who's been a heathen for almost 20 years.
Mm-hmm. Has it been that long?
Yeah.
Good grief. I think it might actually have been that long.
Yeah.
Damn, why'd you have to remind me of that? Okay, you mean in terms of just regional heathen cultures that are developing?
Well, like how it feels like there's this move towards kind of a lack. Well, there is some cultural emphasis. There's
Mhm.
almost this lack of. There's almost this push to build off of that framework and let things develop within individual tribes or regionally how
Mhm.
things are done, whereas, you know, that kind of organically, especially when dealing
Mhm.
with more localized things like whites and ancestors.
Mhm. Well, I mean, if you look at what immediately came to mind when you said whites and ancestors was if you look at, Roman era Germanic practices. I'm thinking of the cults of the matres, the mother goddesses on the Rhine. As far as I can tell, there doesn't seem to have been a single set of goddesses that everybody worshipped. But yeah, you have matrones, mothers that are affiliated with different regions, different tribes, and different roles that they play. And then if you jump the hedge and look at Celtic religion for a bit, we tend to think there was one Germanic pantheon, and that's probably because of Snorri. But if you look at what has survived for Celtic religion, a lot of it seems to have been local gods and goddesses of a particular river or a particular tribe or a particular forest or something like that. And I've got a lurking suspicion that in original heathenry, if you want to call it that, if we had a more unbiased picture of what that looked like, it would look a lot more like Celtic religion. That, different tribes and different areas would have their own gods that didn't necessarily overlap with their neighbors, and different whites and powers that were understood as being the spirits of local places. So my best guess is that by going to the regionalization that we're talking about, we may actually be getting closer to something more like what original heathenry was like. But that's just me. I've got a PhD, so I'm never wrong, but there's always a first time.
So I have one more question for you before
Shoot.
we kind of have to start doing some housekeeping here, and
Mm-hmm.
it comes from Writer, who's a Reddit
Oh.
user,
Mm-hmm.
and she's developed a little bit of an affection for you over the course of this episode, and wants to
Okay.
know if she can keep you and why you're not on Reddit.
Um, I'm not on Reddit because I basically kind of feel like the internet peaked in about 1998 and it's been sort of downhill ever since. I am about as late an adopter as possible. Um, I remember when about 10 years ago, Lauren kept nagging me to get on LiveJournal. And I think I was pretty much the last person to finally get a LiveJournal account before LiveJournal jumped the shark.
So
Um,
please do. Yeah. So now we're trying to get him to get a Facebook. Just same idea.
mhm. Yeah, my mother's on Facebook. What's that commercial? Dude, my mother's on Woo Woo. Yeah, it's kind of the same thing. Yeah, I tend to be. I'm still nostalgic for Usenet. I tend to be just a very cautious and late adopter of all of this newfangled interweb stuff. I tend to, surf the information highway somewhat slowly.
And no, I'll answer that. No, you can't have him because he belongs to my tribe,
Yeah,
and we
that's the other thing.
yeah. And his wife is rather fond of him as well. So
Yeah, she wants to keep me around.
they make
Sometimes I
really
don't
cute.
always understand why, but she does, and
They
I'm
make
I'm grateful for
really
that.
cute kids. That's just to say.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. So thank you. I'm flattered, but I'm afraid somebody's already got me. It's just
Luckily, I
one of
think she
those
was
things.
mostly joking, but
Okay. All right.
um, so it's 8:20, which means there's 10 minutes left in the show.
Oh.
Uh, Ben, do you have anything that you want uh, to kind of pimp and let people know what you're up to now, what projects you have in the pipeline?
Hmm. Well, I do a lot of translations for Iduna. I mean, that's the Troth's journal, and you can actually subscribe without becoming a member. Um, and I think an awful lot of our recent issues will have at least a short thing from me, something that, I like Iduna to have things in it that you can't easily find anywhere else. Um, so, yeah, I've managed to do a pretty good job of that. The next book in the works is a compilation of tales excerpted from the much longer sagas in a book called Flate Jarbok. And again, Flate Jarbok was written in the form that we've got it, mostly, copied and edited by a couple of monks who went out of their way to periodically say, now all of this was happening because of that demon, the evil Oven, who ... but now we have Christ and the promise and trueness and service and worship and bibida bibida bibida. That being said, there's some neat stories in there that, if you know what the bias is, you can kind of reverse engineer them. One of the examples is that tale I mentioned earlier about Ugmund Dit, Ogmund the hard hit, which has that story about Gunnar half and half escaping and hooking up with the priestess of Frey and traveling around with her as she's taking Frey's idol around in a wagon. The way it's written, it's not made to look, the old beliefs look respectable. In fact, it's been called the world's first Swedish joke. But, as I've said, you can still kind of triangulate from it and pick up some useful material if you read it, cautiously and critically. So that's kind of the next big project that I am desperately trying to finish. I've got some other sagas in the works. One of these days I want to pick up, I've got a few translations of some bits of Icelandic folklore recorded in the 19th century about bind runes and magic symbols and things like that. Some things like that have been translated into English, but there's still some untapped stuff that's out there. And may I say, we had a question earlier about using ancient languages. And that's terrific if you want to do that. Some people may want to learn Old Norse, Anglo-Saxon, Old High German, or what have you. But if you want to learn a language for its usefulness to the heathen community now, I think the single thing I'd like to see most would be modern German and modern Scandinavian languages like Swedish, because there's a lot of scholarship, a lot of folklore that hasn't been translated and isn't very accessible. And we've occasionally been able to do this in Iduna, but I wish we could do it more often. Occasionally we've been able to run a translation of an article from, Heldfeuer in Germany, or one of the also true heathen periodicals from, Denmark or Sweden or something like that. And, the heathens that don't speak English as a first language are, writing and doing some pretty awesome stuff. And, I wish we could have a little bit better, conversation with these heathen groups worldwide, just to, keep abreast of what we're all doing. So yeah,
I'm going to cut you short there.
Go ahead.
Because I've only got 5 minutes left, and I've got some stuff I got to do.
Go ahead.
So, as many of our listeners know, we have a Patreon account. It's patreon.com/heathentalk. And one of the benefits to donating is that once a month, I'm going to read out and talk about who has donated to us and thank them publicly for it.
I thought
first, I want to extend my thanks.
I thought in Asatru we didn't have a Patreon, we had a full Trui.
Unfortunately, no one's made a full Trui donation system.
Okay, all right. Well, someone should. Go ahead.
first I've got to thank Neff Andrewson. He's donated to us, I think this is the second month in a row, and we really appreciate it. Then we have
Hail.
Etheric, who has donated. He won one of our books. He's been a huge fan of the show.
And the organizer of Nemo Moot. I'll throw that out there for him.
And the organizer of Nemo Moot. So, I mean, he's been really active, and again, we really appreciate that. I'm not entirely sure who this person is, but he goes by Mad X Stitcher on Patreon. And again, he's donated. I know all you guys are waiting for your audio versions of the Havamal. I've been sick the last week and haven't recorded anything because it would have sounded horrible. I promise I will get to them. You will get the full Havamal before Christmas. I will sit down. If I have to take an entire weekend and do nothing but read out loud, you'll get it before Christmas. Again, if you want to go and be part of that, if you want to receive the audio version of the Havamal, patreon.com/Heathen Talk. You can also find us on Facebook. We are on Twitter at Heathen_Talk. We have these awesome T-shirts. If you look at that right there, it's what they look like.
Oh, nice.
To show off, the shirts did finally come in. So they are really good quality.
You should also buy one.
They're awesome. Yeah, and they're cheap. I mean, really, we're selling them pretty cheap. For, under $15 for a T-shirt, I think. Yeah.
And we are... also, the show is a supporter of Cascadia Moot. I know some of our audience is sick and tired of hearing about Cascadia, but we're putting on a Camp Moot in May of 2016. We need you to go sign up if you're from this region, or if you're from Arkansas and willing to help, keep Lauren company on a plane over here. Please sign up. It's only $50. It covers your whole weekend, all your food. There will be workshops, beer, and I'll be there. And who doesn't want to hang out with me?
Want to let you guys know that I'm going to be at Midwest Winter Moot, not this coming weekend, but the next weekend.
And so am I.
And so is lots of other really awesome people. But I'm throwing this out here for my friends over there at Bifrost Way. Registration for that is going to close on Monday. So we'll have a link on Facebook. Come out to Midwest, support these groups that are running these festivals. My Midwest friends, even though I'm not technically Midwestern, please come out and support these events, because that's really how heathenry is being built. It's through the connections that we make face to face.
Well, and if you have an event you want us to talk about, put it on the Heathen Talk Facebook page, tweet it at us, find us on Reddit and PM us.
There's a link.
Know,
there's a link
we'll
on the Heathen. There's actually a link on our group information on Facebook that has a form you can even fill out. There's lots of ways to do it, but yeah, we want to promote your events. We want to review your books. We want to hear your music. So, Josh, what we got going on next week?
Next week is a very exciting episode for me. I reached out, and we have Chuck Hudson from Raven Radio is going to be on the show next week.
Yes.
I'm a huge Raven Radio fan, and a few episodes back we had Brian Smith on the show, and one of the old Raven Radio hosts, she's not old, but the show is old, showed up in the audience, and I geeked out a little bit on the show about it. That's how big a fan I am. So he's going to be on the show talking about communication and media and heathenry. It's going to be a great show. We look forward to having him. And Torin has said that he will be drunk on a beach and on the show.
This may be the best show we were ever going to do. And there's some big news about Raven Radio, too.
Raven Radio, I'm going to let Chuck...
Yeah,
I'm going to let
you
Chuck
got to tune in
so,
to get the big news.
Other than that, is there anything else important going on?
go to Facebook. The post is going to go live in 1 minute if you're listening live. Otherwise, as soon as you hear my voice, go to Facebook and so you can get 6 Sagas of Adventure. You might win it.
There is one thing, Amber Morgan, if you were listening, you won last week. You won a copy of Peace Weavers and Shield Maidens. We need you to message the show so I can ship this out to you. Really want to ship it to you, you got to get in touch with us.
All right.
And that's about it. Look forward to some more fun promotions and stuff. And remember, you're doing it wrong.
You're not the boss of me.
Y'all have a great week.